Protesters are demanding the release of a woman arrested while federal agents were executing a search warrant in Minneapolis. The group demonstrated outside the Sherburne County Jail today.
At 3:41 a.m. Central Time, federal authorities initiated a coordinated national security operation. That was the line delivered in a sealed briefing room hours later, spoken flatly without emotion, as if emotion itself had been classified. Minneapolis, Minnesota, 3 locations, 1 fortified residence. Over 2.4 tons of narcotics seized, $680 million in assets frozen, and 12 front organizations dismantled in a single night. Officials would later call it one of the most sensitive financial narcotics takedowns ever conducted on U.S. soil. Not because of the drugs alone, but because of who was connected to the money. By sunrise, the name Ahmed Hassan was already circulating through intelligence channels, whispered in federal hallways and encrypted message threads. A man few outside financial crime units had heard of. A man described in sealed affidavits as a shadow financier, a logistics coordinator who never touched drugs, never crossed borders with contraband, and never raised his voice. And yet, according to investigators, his fingerprints were everywhere, on shell companies, on offshore transfers, on narcotics routes that stretched from Latin American supply corridors to Midwest distribution hubs. And buried deeper still was the detail that turned a criminal case into a political explosion. Nur's distant family connection to a high-profile national political figure, unnamed in public documents, but powerful enough to ignite a media firestorm the moment it surfaced. Authorities made one thing clear from the start. This was not about politics. This was about infrastructure, about a financial drug cartel that didn't move bricks through tunnels, but moved billions through spreadsheets. And what you're about to hear only gets darker from here. At 4:17 a.m., the city of Minneapolis was still asleep. Snow clung to the edges of empty streets. Traffic lights cycled through colors for no one. In a quiet suburban pocket just outside the downtown financial district sat what neighbors thought was an aggressively secured private residence. High walls, reinforced gates, surveillance cameras mounted like insects along the roofline. Locals called it the fortress. Few ever saw anyone enter. No parties, no visitors. Just black SUVs that came and went at odd hours, always clean, always unmarked. That's when the street filled with shadows. FBI tactical units moved first, then DEA, then ICE. Black uniforms, no sirens, no shouting, just synchronized movement as federal agents took positions along the perimeter, boots crunching softly over frozen pavement. A mobile command van idled 2 blocks away, its screens glowing blue in the dark. Inside, analysts watched heartbeat monitors and live drone feeds as the clock hit the final mark. The breach came fast. Flashbangs shattered the silence. Gates buckled inward, windows exploded in controlled bursts of glass and smoke. Agents flooded the structure in practiced silence, rifles up, voices clipped and coded. Inside, the fortress was nothing like a home. Reinforced hallways, steel-lined rooms, hidden compartments behind false walls. In the basement, agents found what they had come for, stacks of sealed crates marked as industrial equipment. Inside them, vacuum-packed bricks of cocaine, heroin bundles wrapped in chemical shielding, and plastic tubs filled with fentanyl pills by the hundreds of thousands, stamped with markings meant to mimic legitimate pharmaceuticals. By the time the last room was cleared, agents had logged over 1.6 tons of mixed narcotics from the residence alone. But the night wasn't finished. Simultaneously, federal teams hit warehouse districts along the Mississippi River, storming logistics hubs disguised as import-export firms. Steel doors were blown open. Forklifts sat frozen mid-aisle. Workers dropped to the floor as agents moved past them, opening containers filled with methamphetamine hidden inside legitimate cargo. Across town, financial crime units raided office suites posing as tax consultancies and remittance services. Servers were seized, safes cracked, ledgers pulled from fireproof drawers. And then came the moment that changed the scope of the operation. Inside a climate-controlled room beneath the fortress, agents uncovered a sealed rack of encrypted servers powered by independent generators. No personal data, no family photos, just transaction logs, routing tables, and encrypted authorization keys tied to accounts spanning 4 continents. One agent reportedly said it out loud before realizing microphones were live. "This isn't laundering," he said, "this is command." As dawn approached, federal cyber teams transported the servers under armed escort to a secure facility. Whatever was on them, officials knew instantly, this case had just crossed a line. What started as a narcotics raid was now pointing towards something much larger. A financial architecture designed not to hide crime, but to control it. And as investigators prepared to unlock the data, one warning circulated through the task force briefing. The drugs were only the surface. By mid-morning, the federal complex outside Minneapolis had transformed into a sealed nerve center. Phones were confiscated at the door. Names were replaced with badge numbers. Even senior officials spoke in fragments as if full sentences might leak through the walls. What had been seized overnight was now being pieced together in real time, and the picture forming on the screens was far more dangerous than anyone expected. The servers pulled from beneath the fortress were not ordinary financial records. They were operational maps. Every transaction, every transfer, every delay was intentional. Analysts quickly realized the system wasn't built to move money efficiently. It was built to never be seen. Funds flowed through nonprofit entities, freight insurance pools, and humanitarian supply chains, cycling through jurisdictions with weak reporting laws before reemerging clean. The same money financed narcotics purchases, paid logistics operators, and funded entirely legitimate businesses, all without triggering standard alarms. At the center of the structure was Ahmed Hassan. Not as a kingpin in the traditional sense, but as an architect. He never ordered violence. He never negotiated drug prices. His role, according to investigators, was to design the system that allowed others to operate with near-total invisibility. Each shell company was layered behind another. Each front had legal representation prepared in advance. Even audits were anticipated, with pre-written explanations waiting to be deployed. Agents followed one transaction chain that began with a charitable grant routed through a relief organization registered overseas. Within 48 hours, the same funds reappeared as insurance payouts for a logistics firm, then as equipment financing for an agricultural exporter, and finally as payment to a freight carrier later discovered to be transporting narcotics. No single step was illegal on its own. Together, they formed a perfect crime. As cyber teams decrypted deeper layers of the system, something even more unsettling emerged. Timelines, not just records of past activity but projections, weekly capacity estimates, risk probability charts, notes flagging which ports were stable, which inspection regimes were flexible, and which personnel were reliable. It was a living model, updated constantly, adapting to law enforcement patterns as if it were studying them. This wasn't a cartel reacting to pressure. It was a cartel anticipating it. By early afternoon, task forces in neighboring states were quietly activated. No press releases. No sirens, just carefully worded warrants and silent convoys moving toward secondary targets identified by the server data. Warehouses in Wisconsin, freight yards in Illinois, financial offices in Ohio registered under names that meant nothing until analysts overlaid the metadata and saw the same digital fingerprints repeating again and again. As arrests began, federal leadership faced an uncomfortable reality. This network had not survived by avoiding law enforcement. It had survived by understanding it. Meanwhile, outside the secured perimeter, the story began to leak. A single line from an internal briefing reached a political correspondent. Then another fragment surfaced online. By evening, speculation exploded across news channels and social media. The arrest of a previously unknown financier was suddenly being framed through a political lens, fueled by whispers of family ties to national leadership. Officials refused to comment. Prosecutors declined interviews. Silence only fed the fire. Within hours, a former U.S. president posted a message that detonated across the internet, condemning the case as proof of systemic corruption and demanding answers. The post didn't name names. It didn't need to. The implication was enough to turn a criminal investigation into a national argument. Inside the task force, agents watched the noise with concern. Political attention meant scrutiny, scrutiny meant pressure, and pressure risked collapsing an operation that was still unfolding. Late that night, a senior analyst flagged a final encrypted directory on the seized servers. Unlike the others, it wasn't financial, it wasn't logistical, it was labeled simply Meridian. Access logs showed it had been opened only 3 times in 5 years, always remotely, always briefly. Whatever Meridian contained, it wasn't for daily use, it was for contingency. When the directory finally decrypted, the room fell silent. Because Meridian didn't document what the network had done. It outlined what it would do if disrupted. 3:41 a.m. Washington, D.C. While most of the city slept, a secure operations floor deep inside a federal complex glowed with cold light. Screens lined the walls, each one pulsing with live feeds, data streams, and a national map slowly filling with red markers. The markers were not random, they were coordinated. Each one represented a node in the same hidden system, financial fronts, logistics corridors, safe houses, and transit hubs all tied back to the Meridian contingency plan. This was no longer an investigation. It was an eradication. At precisely 3:58 a.m., the order was given. Federal task forces across multiple states moved at once, cutting through the network before it could adapt. FBI, DEA, ICE, DHS, and joint SWAT units executed synchronized warrants with near-military precision. Helicopters lifted quietly from staging zones. Armored vehicles rolled without sirens. The objective was speed, not spectacle. In northern Minnesota, agents breached a rural logistics depot disguised as a cold storage facility. Inside, they found far more than frozen produce. Hidden behind insulated walls were pallets of narcotics, cocaine bricks sealed in plastic, fentanyl powder vacuum-packed in industrial quantities, and millions of fentanyl pills stamped with false pharmaceutical markings. The drugs had been routed through legitimate agricultural shipments, their weight masked by falsified cargo manifests. In suburban Maryland, a quiet townhouse complex became the site of another strike. The residence appeared ordinary, meticulously maintained, blending seamlessly into the neighborhood. Inside, agents uncovered a command relay, encrypted communication equipment, satellite uplinks, and server racks designed to mirror data in real time across continents. It wasn't a drug house. It was a nerve ending. Simultaneously, ICE units intercepted a convoy on an interstate corridor flagged in the Meridian files. The trucks were registered to a green energy contractor transporting turbine components. Instead, agents discovered concealed compartments loaded with methamphetamine and heroin, packaged for distribution across multiple East Coast markets. Drivers surrendered without resistance. They knew the system had collapsed. As dawn approached, arrests stacked up quickly. Financial controllers, transport coordinators, regional supervisors who had never touched drugs themselves but controlled the flow with spreadsheets and schedules. Each arrest peeled back another layer of the machine, revealing how deeply the network had embedded itself into legitimate commerce. Back in Washington, analysts tracked the collapse in real time. Communication nodes went dark, transfer attempts failed, automated contingency scripts triggered and then stalled, unable to reroute without human authorization. Meridian had assumed disruption. It had not accounted for speed. Then came the political detentions. Shortly after 6:00 a.m., federal marshals executed sealed warrants against several individuals whose names had never appeared in cartel investigations before. Advisors, procurement officials, regulatory intermediaries who had quietly adjusted inspections, delayed audits, and redirected oversight away from critical corridors. None were high-profile public figures, that was the point. They were the invisible gears. Inside one seized office, investigators found pre-drafted statements denying knowledge, each tailored to different scenarios. It was evidence of expectation. They knew exposure was possible. They just didn't believe it would come all at once. By mid-morning, more than 40 locations had been secured, tons of narcotics seized, weapons recovered, financial accounts frozen across multiple jurisdictions. The underworld had taken more damage in 6 hours than it had in the previous 6 years. But the most disturbing discovery came last. Deep within the Meridian directory was a final subfile accessed only once years earlier. It wasn't operational, it was philosophical. A strategic memo outlining the long-term objective, not to hide from the system but to become part of it. To shape policy environments, supply chains, and enforcement priorities so thoroughly that the network would no longer need to conceal itself. This was not a temporary criminal enterprise. It was a plan for permanence. And for the agents reading it, one thing was now painfully clear. The arrests were only the beginning. By the time the sun rose over Washington, the narrative had already split in two. Inside federal buildings, the operation was being described in clinical terms: seizures cataloged, suspects processed, servers imaged, and evidence secured under layers of chain-of-custody protocol. Outside, the country was waking up to something very different. Headlines clashed, commentators argued, political factions rushed to claim the story before the facts had fully settled. And somewhere between those two realities was the truth. In a secure evidence room, investigators began the slow, unsettling work of reconstruction. Hard drives taken from Minneapolis, Maryland, and D.C. were synchronized and replayed like a forensic autopsy. What emerged was not chaos, but design. Logs showed border inspection slowdowns timed precisely with convoy move. Ment's patrol schedules altered just enough to create blind windows. Regulatory reviews postponed at critical moments. None of it looked dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a parallel enforcement system, one that protected a criminal network as effectively as any private army. Internal emails revealed coded language used by compromised officials. Words like maintenance, weather delay, and budget review translated into green lights for narcotics shipments. Investigators counted dozens of facilitators embedded across agencies and private contractors. Some had accepted money. Others had accepted favors, promotions, or future guarantees. Corruption wasn't always purchased. Sometimes it was cultivated. For the agents who had spent their careers believing in the badge, the discoveries cut deep. Veteran officers sat silently as names they recognized appeared on screens. People they had trained with, people they had trusted. The betrayal wasn't loud, it was quiet and personal. Arrests followed quickly but without cameras. Senior planners were taken into custody in offices, homes, and parking garages. There were no speeches, no dramatic resistance, just handcuffs clicking shut as a system turned inward to cleanse itself. Federal leadership made one thing clear behind closed doors: the rebuilding would be ruthless and it would take years. As investigators zoomed out, the scale widened again. Shipping data revealed connections stretching beyond Minnesota and the capital, freight corridors feeding the Midwest, port access points along the East Coast, international transfers disguised as agricultural subsidies and clean energy investments. The network had moved tons of narcotics every week: cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, without triggering alarms, protected by paperwork instead of guns. One final file buried deep in the seized data confirmed what many had feared. The long-term vision was to transform the region into a permanent logistics hub, a place where criminal operations could operate indefinitely under the cover of legitimacy. Not a hideout, a headquarters, a shadow infrastructure designed to outlast administrations, investigations, and public attention. That was the most chilling realization of all. This wasn't about one man. It was about a system that believed it could rewrite the rules quietly enough that no one would notice, until it was too late. By nightfall, officials released a carefully worded statement reminding the public that the case was ongoing and that all allegations remained subject to the judicial process. The disclaimer was necessary. The investigation was real, but this version was a dramatized reconstruction, a fictional warning built from patterns that exist in the real world. Because power doesn't always arrive with gunfire. Sometimes it arrives with signatures, silence, and ambition. If you're still listening, understand this: organized crime doesn't survive by staying in the shadows. It survives by learning how systems work, then positioning itself just close enough to steer them. Stories like this are not predictions, they are cautions. If you believe corruption should be dragged into the light, stay alert, stay critical, and don't look away when the headlines get uncomfortable.